Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to this month's Wellington Trust lecture on the subject of missing medals, unearthing invisible seafaring histories of empire. My name is Alistair Chapman, for those who will be maybe the first time on, and welcome to those especially. And I'm the chairman of the Wellington Trust, which owns the headquarters ship Wellington, the former HMS Wellington, who is berthed down by the law courts on the River Thames by Temple Station. Before we get on to the evening's subject, I'd just like to give my usual housekeeping notes. During the lecture, you would have the opportunity, if you want to ask a question, to leave a question, type it on the Q&A, question and answer icon, which is at the bottom of my screen, and hopefully at the bottom of your screen as well, if not sometimes at the top. If you would like to just use that to type your question in, Jenny Mosley, who is my co-trustee, will be collecting the questions together and will present them at the end of the actual lecture itself. Just to say, as usual, don't use the chat button. That will not actually be the source for questions, and therefore you will not be found if you put something into chat. So just the Q&A icon. At the end of the lecture, if you want to stay on and chat, and we always have extraordinarily enjoyable and rather international conversations on camera, on audio, do stay around. And Matt Edgar, who is in the background, who is, as ever, our IT guru supreme, will actually bring you in into the informal session after the lecture. It may take a little while. I'm not talking about minutes, I'm talking about probably seconds or whatever. But anyway, you'll be most welcome to stay on if you want to chat or to listen as we talk about everything under the sun. And we have some wonderful international members there who can usually give us the weather forecast from the other side of the Atlantic before we get this wretched weather over here. Just to say also that there will be a recording of this lecture. The lecture is now being recorded, and we will be sending you the link to that lecture in the next few days. And of course, you may go back onto the website and see any of our past lectures as well, just by clicking on the link on our website. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers tonight. Asif Shakoor is a member of one of the four families who we have located, who are descended from Lascaux, which, as you who have come on regularly know, is to be the subject of our exhibition, which very sadly we had to postpone 2 or 3 weeks ago because of COVID. We will be actually running the exhibition again next year. We've taken a view to take a long-term view and probably open up around about Easter time, i.e. next April. And we will be covering it with hopefully more source material and information as this comes out, not least with the help of our great friend Asif here as well. We will be letting you know more about that in time. So Asif Shakoor is an independent scholar. He grew up in Manor Park and studied at the University of East London. His grandfather, Mahomed Gama, enlisted in the Mercantile Marine during the Great War and arrived at the Royal Victoria Dock in 1917. Asif wrote about his search for his grandfather's war medals in Britain at War magazine in January 2018. He is also the author of an audio drama piece on this subject, which he calls The Mystery of the Missing Medals, which was recorded for Arch 468 Theatre back in December of last year, December 2020. He was invited by the BBC to represent his grandfather, Mahomed Gama, at the Royal British Legion's Festival of Remembrance, the Royal Albert Hall in Remembrance Saturday in November 2018. Asif is also the author of a forthcoming book, Unearthing Invisible Seafaring Histories of Empire. He has presented research at national conferences and at local events. He has also worked on a project to digitize Cook's certificates, and we'll probably hear more about those, for Indian seamen at the National Maritime Museum. Asif is also the founder of the South Asian Contribution to Great Britain project. Turning now to our other guest speaker, Dr. Georgie Wemyss is a social anthropologist and senior lecturer at the University of East London. She is program leader for the Foundation Year in Social Science and co-director at the Center for Research on Migration, Refugees, and Belonging. From 2013 to 2016, she worked on the EU Borderscapes project, investigating the evolving concepts of state borders in Europe. Previously, she worked as a youth worker in Thai hamlets and lived in India and Bangladesh, where she studied at the Bangla Academy. She has a long-standing research interest in the invisible histories of South Asian seafarers and British identities. Her book, Invisible Empire, White Discourse, Tolerance and Belonging, explores how differing narratives of Britishness obscure colonial histories in ways that work against the belonging of second and third generation British citizens in the present, and how topical that is. Between 2005 and 2007, Georgie was an Economic and Social Research Council postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Research on Nationalism, Ethnicity and Migration at the University of Surrey, and was then a visiting fellow at Goldsmiths College until 2011. Georgie first met Asif when he came on a tour that she regularly leads around the remains of East India docks in Blackwell. On the walk, he shared the remarkable story of his grandfather. Since then, she has interviewed him many times about his continually developing research. And it's not least for that the reason that we are delighted and indeed privileged to have both Georgie and Asif here this evening to do this once more. Over to you, if I may, Georgie and Asif.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alistair, for the introduction and including in that how we met. So yes, as Alistair said, I'm going to be interviewing Asif about his amazing family history and his findings. We've spoken many times in many spaces about this, and each time Asif has unearthed many more treasures, as they've been called by the Wellington Trust, and we're going to be talking about some of those. So I'm going to start off, Asif, by asking you to start off by telling us the story of your grandparents and the box that you discovered in Pakistan, which is the whole beginning of this story for you.
That's right. Well, I was visiting Pakistan in 2011 with my family, with my mother and my sister, and my mother was on about this box my grandmother had. I had to search for it, and my grandmother's belongings were all thrown into my great uncle's garden. And my great uncle was saying, if there's anything you might wish to keep, might wish to have a look at, you might wish to take now before we discard all of it. So I had a look, and there was a walking stick, and my grand uncle was saying, perhaps you might wish to keep the walking stick. And my mother was on constantly about finding a wooden box which my grandmother had, and that she would never let anyone touch it. And there was an occasion which my mum described when the wooden box was higher on a shelf, and my mother tried to have a look at it, have a sneaky look in it. And my grandmother freaked out and stopped her from looking at this box. And my mother was on about finding this box because she found that this box is really precious. It probably has something in it, a land papers or house papers, and tried to find this box. And I was thinking that I was telling my mom that it's all a load of rubbish. Perhaps we should throw it away. And that's where the story began from.
So in the end, you agreed to find the books, and you opened the box. So I'm going to show a few slides which will illustrate what you found in it. So I'll just go from the start. Yeah, so this is one of the letters that you found in there.
I can't see the slide.
Okay, the slides is the Ackles and Pollock.
Yeah, that's right. The Ackles and Pollock is actually a telegram to address to my father concerning the death of my grandfather, and it was dated 4th of October 1965, and it mentions about the pension that my grandfather had a pension system in place, and that it was for my, and it was addressed to my to my father. And then
yeah, carry on.
So on the left is just an advert for Ackles and Pollock. My grandfather actually worked there between 1959 to 1965, shortly before he left back for Pakistan in February 1965, and then he passed away in August 1965.
So this was you didn't know very much about your grandfather, but you found out therefore that you knew that he'd been working in the UK and that he died in 1965. But then the other papers began to show things that you really didn't know anything about. So can you see the slide that I put up now? Which can you see those?
I can't actually see the slide.
Okay, I hope everybody else can see the slide. So it's the letter from your grandmother to the Ministry of Social Security, yeah, and the reply from them.
That's right, Georgie. I found from the box a set of letters that really inspired me where my journey began. One of these letters, as you can see on the screen, two of the letters. One of these was from the Minister of Social Security from the Overseas Group, and from Newcastle, and it was dated 11th April 1967. And it mentions about, it's noted that the 1914, 1918 war medal supplied by you in support of your claim bear on the rim the inscription Mahomed Gama. And then there's another letter on the left of the screen, which was from my grandmother addressed to the Ministry of Social Security. And she says, with due respect and humble submission, I beg to request that I have submitted an application dated 27th June 1966, and then 8th August 1966. But up to this time, I have not received any reply. I'm a widow and have no means of livelihood and anxious for action on my mercy petition. And then she mentions about my husband served during the war in the Merchant Navy.
So the next slide is a later reply from the Ministry of Social Security, June 1967.
Yeah, that's a further letter, sorry, dated the 8th of June 1967. And this letter mentions about the income tax certificate, statement of holiday pay, and 2 war medals are returned herewith. But when I returned, but actually, I didn't actually find the medals inside the box. And I was really curious to know where the medals are.
So what you found was the trail of letters from your father and then from your grandfather trying to find out the details and get the pension to which your grandmother was entitled. And what you found were letters showing that the medals had been sent as a proof of identity and that they should have been returned, but there were no medals in the box. That's
right, George. Yeah, I didn't know that he actually had war medals, but from the letters I got understanding that he had some sort of war medals. I wasn't sure at the time what nature were these medals, but all I knew that he had some war medals and they were not in the box.
But there was something else which was really interesting in the box, and this is a continuous discharge certificate for somebody with a different name.
That's right. I found a continuous discharge certificate for someone by the name of Rohama Hassan. And this actual certificate was a certificate of service for Rohama Hassan in the Mercantile Marine. And it was dated the 14th of March, 1914. And it mentioned about the vessels he served in, and it also mentioned it carried a thumbprint of him on the left side of the certificate.
And it showed some of the ships. Some of the ships that he'd sailed on?
That's right, Georgie. It showed some of the ships that he sailed on, and I began looking into this. I came across the SS Mongolia. Although I opened the certificate up, it was actually folded up, and I actually opened it really in a rough manner, and I didn't actually realize how important this document was, and I thought it's just a piece of old paper, and let me have a look what it is. So I opened it up really roughly, fast, and I found out that he had served on vessels such as the SS Syria, the SS Delta, the SS Kaiser Hind, and then on the top part, which is missing of the certificate, there's a couple of numbers of 508, and I from those low numbers I located, because the remainder of the vessels have the vessel numbers there, but this particular vessel didn't have the vessel number there, but it had a 508 number next to it. So I located this from that number, and I found out it was the SS Mongolia. And now these vessels were it was quite interesting, because some of these vessels were involved in transporting troops, such as the SS Delta. It was involved in transporting, it was actually a hospital ship during the war. And we find the SS Kaiser Hind, which was again a troop transport, and I came across various lunch menu cards for 1919, and they actually mentioned His Majesty's transport. So I thought, what is His Majesty's transport? And I came to realize it's a troop transport, and it was actually transporting troops back from Australia to London, from London back to Australia.
So I'm going to stop you there talking about Rohama Hassan, because he's not your grandfather. You don't know who he was. You don't know why his continuous discharge certificate was in the box. So we'll come back to him a bit later, but the next slide is just showing some pictures of the two medals that were referred to in your grandmother's letter. Because what you then decided to do was to search for these medals. So would you like to say something about these medals and what you then decided to do about them?
That's right, Georgie. These are the two images you see on the screen are probably the Mercantile Marine War Medal and the British War Medal, which is also referred to as the General Service Medal. But I won't read out the information on the cards. These are actually cigarette cards. And 2,000 of these medals were awarded to Indian seafarers, and these were sort of manufactured in the UK in Woolwich in Arsenal, and they were dispatched by ship to India, and they were distributed in India. And these Indian seafarers had to apply through the local magistrate or through the Bombay, the shipping master, for these medals, and there was strict criteria for them. It wasn't just easy to get them. Something like 51,000 seafarers served in the First World War, and Rosina Visram, she wrote a book called Agents in Britain, 400 Years of History, and she documents this figure in her book. And the criteria for these medals would have been something like 6 months of continuous service through a designated war zone on a designated vessel that was serving in the war. So it wasn't quite straightforward to apply for these medals.
So this was telling you more about your grandfather than you'd ever known before. The very fact that he had these medals awarded to him was beginning to fill in some of the histories. But you wanted to find more, and the next slide is showing some detail about the advert that you sent out, trying to track down these medals.
That's right, Georgie. I ran adverts inside the Medal News on several occasions on various different editions of the Medal News magazine. So one of the adverts you can see on the screen is the actual Medal News advert, and I tried to track the medal down, and I couldn't actually find where it was, and I actually wrote something like envelopes addresses of 188 medal dealers and auctioneers in the UK and abroad, in South Africa, Australia. I was about to post these envelopes out to the medal dealers to track this medal down, because I seemed to have no luck in finding it. And eventually I came across Should I carry on to the?
No, let's leave that till the end. We're going to leave the medals for the moment. We're going to leave Asif in the background looking for the medals and move on to what you found out, because as you were searching for the medals, you started the whole research process of trying to find out more about what your grandfather had been doing. And the next few slides are some of the documents that you've accumulated in trying to search out what life was like for your grandfather as an Indian seafarer in the period around the First World War. So the first one is referring to the term Lascaux, which was mentioned at the beginning. So I don't know if you want to say something about this.
Yeah, because my grandmother said that my grandfather was in the army. This was transmitted via one link through oral history from my mother. She was the single link between me and my grandmother. And I couldn't understand how was he in the army, because he was a seafarer and it didn't quite make sense to me. So I was searching army records in the National Archives and I was having no luck for his name. And I thought, how could it be in the army? And yeah, actually, I got to understand when I searched the word Lascaux, which comes from the Persian word Lashkar, which comes from the Arabic word askil. And Lashkar was actually, Lascaux actually meant East Indian sailor. And on the crew list, my grandfather was referred to as East Indian sailor. And it was ultimately from the Persian word Lashkar, which meant army, which gave me a broad understanding why my grandmother said he was in the army, because the actual word Lashkar actually meant army. But again, it was a misapplied word for Lashkar. Lascaux, sorry, was a misapplied word for Lashkar. And this I found from the Oxford Concise Dictionary published in 1911. Shall I go on to the other documents?
Yeah.
And then I came across another interesting document, which you can see probably on the screen on the left-hand side, which is a Lascaux agreement. It's a copy of agreement to be made accessible to the crew. So it's a copy made accessible to Indian seafarers. And it was a copy that kept on the deck of the ship. And you wouldn't find this. This is a rare copy, which I haven't actually found through my research a copy of this in the British Library or the National Archives. Although you find agreements in the British Library which are blank but not filled in, but they're not the agreements where you'd actually fill names on. But for this one, you wouldn't find, because it's actually a copy of agreement made accessible to the Asian crew. And it's a document for the city of Newcastle, and this vessel was built in Liverpool, and it was dated the 30th of February 1951 in Bombay. So, and it describes the food the Indian seafarers received, such as rice, dal, lentils, ghee, butter, and so forth, and flour, and the rules of what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do.
And as you said in Rosina Visram's 400 Years of History book, she documents very closely about the pay and the conditions and the food allowances and the clothing allowances that were given to Indian seafarers, being all much, much lower than those that European seafarers were entitled to on these articles. So the next one, Mirza Abu Talib Khan. So this is a much earlier reference to Lashkars.
That's right. I came across the travels of Mirza Abu Talib Khan in Asia, Africa, and Europe. And this book was actually wrote in the Persian language by Mirza Abu Talib Khan, who was a Persian scholar. And this book was actually, it covers the time that Mirza Abu Talib Khan stayed in London in 1799. And it was actually translated into English by Charles Stewart. And it mentions on page 21 about indolent and inexperienced Bengal Lascars. So it refers to the Bangladeshi Lashkars, the seafarers. And it was quite interesting, but it's not the first book that documents South Asian seafarers and their presence in the UK. Rosina Visram, in her book Asians in Britain 400 Years of History, she gives a much earlier account, 1730, of John Mahmood. Probably it was Jahan Mahmood, but his name was anglicized to John Mahmood, and he was marked in the parish records as a Lascar, and he was buried at St Anne's Limehouse. And I went to have a look at St Anne's Limehouse, and I couldn't actually find his grave because most of the gravestones are dilapidated and disintegrated, and was probably, maybe he was buried in an unmarked public grave.
Mm. And I think some of the invisible Indian seafarers can be linked to documents such as this, where I think which you've included here. Would you like to explain this slide?
That's right. This is a copy of an agreement of account of crew, and you find crew lists and agreements at the National Archives, and you find this similar document probably in the National Archives for, you know, the war and before the war as well. And this is for the Vodala, which is a vessel of the British India steam navigation. And then on the pages here on the right hand side, it lists all the entire crew, the British crew from the UK that served on this vessel. And then at the bottom of the page, it actually says remainder of crew on Asiatic articles. So the Asian crew, the South Asian crew, or you know, even from probably China, Far East China, they would not have signed on this agreement. They would have signed on something which was called a Lascaux agreement.
What was life like for your grandfather? You've managed to find various pictures, and I've included one of them here, which are representations of what it must have been like in the ship's engines. Do you want to say something about this and other things that you've found out?
Yeah, this is actually from the P&O pencilings, and it shows a stoke hole, and it says CD boys, firemen at work. So CD boys refers to the African seamen. And I think my grandfather was a very big bloke. From what I hear from oral history and having seen the very few images of him, he was actually at the age of 70. He was actually still a very big person. He was actually built. And my late father actually described him as having a double body, meaning that he was quite a big bloke. And he worked in Lascaux Abroad in the yard, outdoors in the winter and the heat as well, stacking huge steel pipes and tubes that came off on the line. I was stacking them in the open air in the yard. So he was actually quite a big person. I think something like working as a fireman, shoveling coal into the hot furnace he would have best suited him. And as the Punjab seamen were very strong, and I think there's a book I came across that mentioned that they could stand temperatures of 90 degrees centigrade. So my grandfather was shoveling coal and into the furnace, and I had an experience of what it was like when I went on the steamboat, the steam tug Portly, and I actually had the experience of shoveling coal into the furnace. It was actually quite difficult, and I couldn't stand it.
Mm. You've got so many hundreds of photographs, and there's just a few selected ones which illustrate some of your findings. So I'm just going to go through them for you to say whatever you like about them.
So one of them you see is called Lascaux Abroad. Really, it shows the South Asian seafarers pulling a rope on a ship, and that was actually published in the supplement, the Times Weekly edition, on September 28th in 1922, and that was just the same period at time that Mahomed Hassan was still serving in the Mercantile Marine with the P&O, but on Narkunda, the P&O Narkunda in 1922. So I thought it was relevant to have this to share this. And then we find other articles such as this was published inside the Times, Illustrated Times of London, and it shows life on board of P&O liner, and the roll call on a Sunday morning. It shows the South Asian crew while they are standing up for the captain and the chief engineer and so forth. And then we come across I came across another one which was published again in the Illustrated London News, and it shows this mentions about Mohammedans in England, and it shows the Muharram festival at the docks. And this was actually interesting because this was published in 1892, and it shows South Asian seafarers at the Royal Victoria dock which is in Newham, and the Royal Victoria dock was the same dock where my grandfather docked at on the SS Kiva in 1917 during the First World War, and while he stayed there for a month whilst the Kiva was refitted for the onward journey to New York.
So we're gonna come back to the Kiva and the First World War in a minute. I'm just gonna but this is amazing representations from ideas of what it was like in the ship's engines, boiler rooms, through to the displays put up on the deck, to what was happening, representations of what was happening in the docks at that time. These two sets of images are also from before the First World War, when it looks as though there were lots of debates going on about whether Indian seafarers should be employed or not.
That's right. Sorry, George.
Now go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. It's quite interesting because one of these articles published inside the Illustrated London News in 1906, and it shows about a series of top Lascars on British ships, the question of their retention, and then it shows various images of the works, the nature of the work they've done. It shows some of them shoveling coal into a furnace, and it shows others in London at the Seaman's Rest, and then again you find another image published in the Illustrated London News for 1911, and it shows saving London from starvation, importing food, and again it shows South Asian seafarers. And one of them you can see is distinctly dressed in a hat and a beard, and he's actually lifting boxes off a vessel that's just docked at the docks in London. Then again, then again we find another image which says the challenge, the sinking of the ship. It says a Lascar crew watching the last plunge of a U-boat victim, and it shows, and that's actually a scene, a very rare scene that you see of South Asian seafarers, being rescued from a vessel that's being torpedoed by a German U-boat, and the vessel is actually sinking, and it shows South Asian seafarers being rescued and taken on board a ship or a boat to shore.
And I think quite often when you're reading or looking at these pictures, you're having to kind of read between the lines, because some of the descriptions, what's being said, obviously coming from a particular perspective, not the perspective of the people who are being written about, the Indian seafarers. But so this brings us up to the First World War, and back to your grandfather Mahomed Gama, and so we're now going to move on to, and I know that you managed to identify many of the ships that he was on during and around the time of the First World War. This is a picture of one which you're going to be focusing on today. A new photograph. I haven't seen this one before. It's so alive. I wonder what you'd like to say about this.
It's actually an interesting photo, and I found it when I first saw it. I found it really interesting when I saw the people just by this ship that I hadn't seen before. It's actually an image that was circulated or published in 1915. And I purchased this from a seller, in Australia. And it's interesting because the seller actually told me that I was the first buyer from the United Kingdom to purchase the image. They've never actually sent one out to the United Kingdom before. And it shows the vessel, the Kiva, which was built for the P&O. And this was the vessel that my grandfather served on. And this image is taken in 1915 before my grandfather served this vessel.
So how did it feel seeing such an image of the ship that he was on?
It's actually really interesting because the more I see a real life image, it gives me a taste of what a steamship must have looked like. How huge were they? What sort of vessels these were? And I just imagine I would like to see and imagine my grandfather working in the stokehole, in the engine room. But it's just something that's difficult to see.
But you know that you definitely know that he was on the Kiva, and I'm going to show some of the crew lists in a minute. But you also know that that ship with him in it definitely docked here at Tilbury. Is that right? That's
right, Georgie. The vessel actually arrived on the 7th of December 1918, and it docked at Tilbury docks. And I saw this on the crew list, the listings where it says that it docked at Tilbury, and that was because Arthur Bacon, I'm not sure if he was an engineer or his actual position, but he had actually died of pneumonia on the vessel. So he docked at Tilbury docks to release his body on the docks, and that image you see on the screen is actually the Tilbury dock where the P&O berth is. So I presume he may have docked there, he could have docked somewhere else, but that's the P&O berth.
And then when it docked at Tilbury, it was actually heading for the Victoria Dock in the current London Borough of Newham, which is where you live and where I work. So what would you like to add about the Victoria Dock?
It's interesting because I didn't know exactly what the Victoria Dock was until you actually pointed out to me, George, during a visit. The Victoria Dock is quite a huge dock, and all that survives today is literally the cranes that were used to, unload and offload cargo off the ships. And what I found is that my grandfather stayed there on the 8th of December, the Kiva dock there, and I know my grandfather stayed there for a month at the Royal Victoria Dock.
So I'm just showing. I just showed the current day picture of the dock, and then I've just moved on to the official logbook, which is your proof that it was at the Royal Victoria Dock at that time. How did you find this? How did you find this item? Yeah,
this item I found from the National Archives in the UK at Kew. And the vessel, there's actually an official logbook which is a crew list of the British crew that were serving on the vessel, and it says about the time it set off from London on 3rd August 1917, and it arrived in Bombay, and then it shows about the 10th of December 1917 when the Harold William Potter, who was the commander of the vessel at the time, handed the logbook at the Royal Victoria Docks. And how I noticed that he came at that the vessel docked at the Royal Victoria Docks, because it says on there very vaguely London, Victoria, DKS, and I came to conclude that there's only one dock where large steamers would dock at, and that was probably the Royal Albert Dock and the Royal Victoria Dock, where large steamers arrived at, and they were designed to host and hold these huge steamers that arrived on the Eastern service from Far East, Australia, India. They would arrive there.
Can I just ask you what date that map is that you included?
Yeah. The map is from 1910, I believe.
Right.
And yeah, and the map is quite an old map, and I thought it was interesting because it shows the East India Docks nearby, and I know that you do a walk there, Georgie, too, as well, the East India, West India Docks.
Yeah, and very much. I mean, he was first there, you think, around possibly 1915 was the first time that he would have landed, possibly in the Victoria Docks, even earlier than the Kiva.
I do know that he served on the P&O Multan, and he arrived in London it just says Port of London in 1913. But I've not had a chance to explore a crew list official log survives that period, and to see if there's any information on there which might indicate in the Port of London, where in the Port of London, because the Port of London was huge. It covered the West India Docks, East India Docks, Millwall Docks, Surrey Docks, Royal Albert, Royal Victoria, as well as Tilbury Docks. So it's so huge. Unless the logbooks, I haven't had a chance to look at the logbook to see exactly pinpoint which docks he would have arrived at.
But he was definitely in London in 19.
That's right.
You know that.
That's right.
Yeah. So coming back to 1918, we're reaching towards the end of the First World War. So this is the logbook. I'm now moving on to the Kiva crew lists, and there's several of them here. And what I've done for people watching is I've cut off the crew lists at the point where your grandfather's name is listed, Mahomed Gama. So he's listed as number 12 on this one. Yeah, so Asif, what would you like to say about these crew lists?
That's right. This crew list shows the Kiva arriving in New York, and I think I tried to investigate which port they arrived at, and I actually found out it was port 56 in New York. And it shows the Kiva arriving there 21st January, and then I explored Dada Ahmed Haider Khan's book, who was a seafarer with my grandfather, on the Kiva, and he writes in his book, 2-volume book called Chains to Lose Life and Struggles of a Revolutionary, Memoirs of Dada Ahmed Haider Khan. He mentions something about how they stayed at the Royal Victoria Dock for a month before the Kiva was moored out and towed by tugs out deep into the ocean and propelled, and they set off the first week of January to New York and arrived there 21st January. And this crew list states where the position of my grandfather, the role he had, which was as a fireman, and it also says about his weight, his height, and I know that he was quite a tall person, and the crew list shows his height as 5'8", and again it shows his age, 23.
So 23 in 1918.
That's right. That's right.
And the second one is May 1918, also New York, also coming from London.
That's right. It's coming again from London. So I know that they made a couple of voyages from London all the way from January to the armistice. Just a few weeks before the armistice was declared, they had traveled to and from New York, transporting troops from New York to London. And these troops, the American troops, would make the onward cross-channel journey to France as part of the war effort.
So he's number 8 on this list, and then the next list, he's right at the bottom. I can't even read the number there, but this is the July list coming straight from Liverpool, I think, this time.
Yeah, that's right. It's coming straight from Liverpool, and his name occurs on line 24. And they docked at they arrived in New York on the 8th of July, and I looked to try to explore when would they have left from New York, and I came across a book called The Road to France, the Transportation of Troops and Military Supplies, 1917-1918, and it's by Crowell and Wilson. And this book was published in 1921, and I actually found that from this book that they left New York, they sailed from New York on the 14th of July. So the crew list says they arrived the 8th, and they left on the 14th. We're carrying 1,200 or so American officers and personnel of the armed forces.
And these amazing pictures that I think you got from, is it called the Sphere? Is it the magazine that you found these?
That's right. I got these from the Sphere, and it says about the massing of the American army. It shows a division leaving New York for training, and then you find the other image, which again from the Sphere, and that's dated in 1918 again, and it shows the armistice celebrations at New York, and you can see a very big elaborate celebration for the armistice.
And I think you've also spoken before about how some people didn't necessarily return on the ships, and were able to somehow or other leave the ships in New York.
It's actually quite interesting, George, because I was looking at some crew lists held at the National Archives in Kew, and I came across Mir Faisal, who was again another seafarer with my grandfather, and he actually died at sea before they arrived back to New York. And Harold Potter, the commander of the Kiva, noted that his funeral was performed and how he was entered, he noted in brackets, deep into the ocean, and how his funeral was performed and he was buried at sea. And then again, I find about other seafarers such as Abdullah Ali, who died of syphilis. Again, he died on arrival to New York, and he died at 21st January 1918. So it was actually a tough job where some seafarers lost their lives due to illness, disease, and sickness.
And then, of course, Khadikhan, who left the ship in order to do other things in the US, which you said earlier.
That's right. Yeah, it's interesting about Dada Ahmed Khadikhan, because I was looking at the crew list and I found out that him and another seafarer called Wabdin Ditta, and now Wabdin Ditta was, I think, a fireman, and Dada Ahmed Khadikhan was a baniwala, a waterman, and bani usually means water. So they both were seeking a better life, and so they actually deserted on arrival to New York, and there was a form entered, into the logbook which showed that they deserted and they ran away. And Dada Ahmed Khadikhan mentions how he explored New York and tried to find an accommodation as cheap accommodation.
And then he went back and he fought for freedom in British India, didn't after he managed to get back there.
That's right. He became later on in life. He became a great communist leader, a revolutionary leader in Pakistan and India, and he fought for freedom and all sorts of rights.
So leaving the Kiva, there's other ships that Mahomed Gama, your grandfather, worked on, and one of them was the Medina.
That's right. One of them was the Medina, and he served on the Medina in 1916, and I think possibly he may have boarded in 1915 December. That's looking at a crew list at the National Archives when the Medina left London, and he sailed all the way to Australia, and it was in New Sydney, South Wales. So it was Australian. It was quite interesting because to find that he was a fireman on board this vessel. And one of the images, I don't know if you can see on the screen, but it was of the P&O, of a threesome love cup, which was sold on board the P&O Medina. And there's only one shop, a barber shop. And there's only one barber shop, and this love cup was being sold there on board the ship.
And you've managed to buy that cup. So that's
right.
Your collection, yeah.
And I hope that will be displayed as part of the artifacts, physical objects that I give towards the exhibition on South Asian seafarers on the HQS Wellington, which takes place next year.
So now I'm moving back to the mysterious Bahamut Hassan. And you've managed to track down, as you were saying earlier, a little bit more information about him. He had turned up in your box, his continuous discharge certificate. So what did you manage to find out about the ships that he was on?
I managed to find out that he was on various vessels such as the SS Delta, which is a hospital ship, transporting wounded, sick and ill soldiers to and forth from the various war fronts. And then we find the SS Kaiser Hind, which was a troop transport. And then again, I looked into his name and I realized that his name was actually anglicized as Rohama, because it was actually, if you look in the various Urdu dictionaries of names or various Arabic dictionary names, you wouldn't actually find the name Rohama because it doesn't exist. It's actually Rahima. So it's Rahima Hassan. And I found him, and then when I tracked his actual name down, I found out his name was actually anglicized. When I found his actual name, I found out he was actually on further crew lists, and one of them that he was on the P&O Narkunda in 1922. And that was, again, interesting to note that he was serving on that vessel, and that his name had actually been spelled as Rahima on there, and the age was the same. And he was actually born in the Punjab in 1895, 1896.
Amazing, amazing. And again, just showing how difficult it can be to try and track people such as your grandfather and Rahima Hassan because of the way that the names are recorded and differently on different lists as well, possibly. Okay, so having explored some more things about your grandfather's life, we're now going to just zoom forward to the Second World War, because in the process of trying to find out more about Mahomed Gama, you also unearthed some really interesting photographs of Indian seafarers who were torpedoed in the Second World War. And there's a few images here which you wanted to share.
That's right. One of the images is of actually reads on the back of it. These four members of the Lascaux race from India, Bengal. And actually, Lascaux was not a race, but I won't go into detail here on that. And there was four Bangladeshi seamen who were rescued from a vessel that had been torpedoed and they were rescued on October 10th, 1940. So it was actually interesting to find, because there's a large number of Bangladeshi seafarers that served in the Second World War, as well as before the World Wars, but is not often probably known so well as it should be known. And then again, we find another image of a seafarers having tea in New York, and it's actually interesting because it shows three Bangladeshi seafarers, two with the beard and a hat, wearing hats, having tea. And they're again survivors of a torpedo torpedoed vessel.
And I think it says that the club that was set up in New York was only for seafarers who had survived being torpedoed. Is that right?
That's right. It says on the open club for Indian seamen, and the actual image was taken on 14th of May, 1943. That was during the World War, Second World War.
Fantastic images. So if anybody is here who recognises anybody in any of these pictures, please get in touch with Asif. So we're now going to move on to the medals themselves, which were at the beginning of your story. So, so would you, Asif, like to conclude to share with everybody about what happened to those medals?
Yeah, I tried to, Georgie, track down where these medals are, and I ran various sites on medal news. I visited medal fairs in Edgware, and I visited various medal fairs up and down the UK, contacted dealers, I spoke to Spinks of London, and I managed to find one of the medals, which was actually the British War Medal, which was actually, I happened to prepare envelopes with 188 addresses on them to send out to various dealers and auctioneers in the UK. And it was just a coincidence that one night I decided after running these exhaustive searches, I decided to run one final search in the hope that I might find something. And I came across a website called www.coinsale.co.uk. And I first had a look on this, I browsed this website, and I did think that my grandfather's medal would be on there. But I happened to just enter the name of my grandfather as it was anglicized, with the anglicized spelling in the search box, and it yielded some results which showed Mahomed Gama, and it showed a British War Medal, and it was actually on sale. And I contacted the dealer selling this medal, and that was Jim Strawbridge up in Devon. And I actually contacted him through Facebook as well, through various other channels, and he got back to me, and I managed to buy the medal back from him, and I actually have the medal here. Sorry, Georgie, I have this Heinz baked beans in tomato sauce can up here, but it's actually not beans in here. I've actually got the medal in here. I'll just quickly show it. And this was the actual original British War Medal that was given to my grandfather for his service in the First World War. And the other medal was the Mercantile Marine War Medal, which again I couldn't find or locate. I ran slides inside the medal, news, adverts. I put adverts on Facebook, Twitter, social media, and again, this medal I actually found it being sold by E-Medals, an auctioneer based in Canada, in Ontario, Canada, and I contacted them, and I didn't have much result. I spoke to someone called Michael. I spoke to the founder as well, Barry Turk, and I actually found that the medal has actually been sold, and it was sold to a buyer in India in 2016. So I didn't have much luck in trying to find it and get the medal back from India, because India is quite a remote place to track the medal down.
But this is an image of it. It's got your grandfather's name written on it. You know that this is his medal.
His name was actually abbreviated on this, MAHD with a dot. But I know it was his medal.
So, Asif, we're just coming to an end now. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your family history with me and with everybody else. I mean, the tracking down of the medals that you've been doing has unearthed so much, and continues to unearth so much more about not only your history but British history and global history. So we're just finishing with a picture of your grandfather and your father. I think that this was shortly before he died.
Yeah, that's right, Georgie. That's actually an interesting image, because that's actually on the left is my father, my late father, who actually lost his life. He was due to COVID in December, which left him really unwell. And then the right-hand side is my grandfather, and it's a very nice image because it's for my father that I have, and for my grandmother that I have what I have, and he was the link to my grandfather, my father. And I actually never met my grandfather in my lifetime, but I hear the oral stories about him and how how much of, and that he could speak very little English, and that he worked very hard. He was very hard working. So I thought it'd be nice to share this image of my father and my grandfather.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing.
And thank you both, if I might say, for the most fascinating and in some ways very moving testimony on lives of those who served at sea. The fact that it is your family, I think it makes it even more pertinent and real to us. May I express our deep sympathies for the loss of your father to COVID. How often we're hearing that now, which is awful. And what a good looking chap he was. I won't go any further with the sycophancy, but I can recognize the family likeness, let's put it that way. I did a bit of research beforehand, actually, fun enough, and I looked at it again when the slide came through. And this sounds a bit of an odd one, Asif, but amongst the, obviously, what were the conditions on board a ship? How were the crew treated, particularly the Asian crew? These are rhetorical questions. They're not necessarily for you, because you will know some of these answers anyway. But
it's an interesting question. It's a very, very good question, actually, because I was looking at the lives of Asian crew, and I find that it was tough. And I came across a book called The Blight of Insubordination, which documented how the Punjabi seaman could withstand the intense temperatures through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal of 90 degrees centigrade in the stoke hole. And the conditions were tough, actually. And I came across various books such as The Asiatic in England by Joseph Salter, which mentions about how some were mistreated, and some South Asian crew, when they arrived in London in 1873, the book was published in 1873, and he mentions about how they were mistreated and they were force-fed pork or something along these lines. So it's actually interesting when you look at the various angles, how they were treated, and the nature of the job they'd done, which was tough in itself.
yeah, indeed. One of the things that put me onto this track and got me thinking again was nutrition, because you said that he was known, your grandfather, as having a double body. And in fact, if we looked at that, he was, in those lists we saw, he was never lower than fourth tallest in the group of sailors, of seamen. But I did a quick BMI check, body mass index check on him, as if he were alive today and he was serving today. He was 5'8" tall. He was 130 pounds, which in old money is about 9¼ stone. And he was aged 23, and he was Pakistani. I put all those factors into the NHS BMI calculator. And actually, stupidly, it doesn't come up with the actual figure, but it's somewhere around about 16 to 17 BMI. And the comment on the site is, your results suggests you are underweight. Well, by golly, he was, and they probably all were. And if they had a diet of rice and ghee and whatever might have been local produce, maybe, you can understand how it was. And I wonder whether their diet was different to the rest of the crew. Certainly would have been the master and the officers. But that's just a general observation, not a question. The other thing I noticed with interest was that, in fact, in the Illustrated London News Sunday morning roll call illustration, the master of the ship's going along saluting with his left hand, which I find rather strange. Probably not disrespectful, but maybe that was just the artist getting it wrong, or maybe there was a tradition. And the question I really wanted to ask you as well is, you refer to these cooks' certificates, and you're doing research on those for the National Maritime Museum. Can you tell us a little bit more about the significance of cooks' certificates, Asif?
It's quite significant because you find often the Portuguese crew or the loose or Asian crew served as cooks, or the Bangladeshi crew were often serving as cooks on these ships. And these cook certificates were found in the National Maritime Museum. I don't think it's been too long ago, actually. And these cook certificates, we actually, the project I worked on, we selected some of the best crew, the best certificates for their uniqueness. And the peculiar things, like there was an image on one of the cook certificates where one of the cooks was wearing a peculiar medal, which I thought would look very strange. So I selected that certificate to be digitized. So I looked at these various details, and eventually I think the National Maritime Museum found it very inspiring. They decided to digitize the entire certificates. So I think it's been completed now, but I've not got around to finding out if it's been complete or not.
Oh, well, that's fascinating. So that's indicative of the fact there's so much more research to be done, which I guess you're going to involve yourself in. And I think as time goes by, and it may be there's a bit of a blessing in the fact that we had to postpone the exhibition. And I think probably and hope that we can get some more of your fantastic research through to demonstrate in the exhibition next year. Before I move over to Jenny, I just want to read, and there was one that came up on chat. I thought, is that a question? But in fact, it was a comment from Naina Manjareka. I hope I haven't mispronounced your name, Naina. And she has said, or he has said, lovely talk. What amazing archival detective work, Asif, exclamation mark. And I would totally endorse that. Thank you so much. Over to Jenny Mosley, who is our board lead, very much on the marketing side and development, and is deputy chair of the Friends of the Wellington Trust. Over to you, Jenny.
Thank you very much, Alistair. Before I start with a few questions that are still coming in, I wanted to say how amazing Asif has been on helping us with our exhibition. We've made a film star out of him. He's in our film, which accompanies the exhibition. And he and Georgie both came to the All Hallows by the Tower unveiling of the memorial book to people who died at sea, sailors who died at sea. And the Trust, as part of our filming, put 15 names of South Asian seafarers who had died when they were struck by a torpedo in 1917. And all of them were from the engine room, and none of them is commemorated anywhere else. So we thought it was only fitting that they should be commemorated somewhere. So we have taken that move, and thank you very much, Georgie and Asif, for coming to that unveiling. So having made a film star out of you, we are also making a still exhibition star out of you, because we have taken photographs of all of Asif's wonderful collection mementos that he has, and he is actually loaning to us the medals and some other, the piano, ashtray and cup, and some other mementos from his research, which is very, very kind of him. So we look forward to showing you all of those things next Easter when we open the exhibition. So I just wanted to say that. You also went on board the Portway, the steam tug Portway, and talked a little bit about your experiences in shoveling some coal into the steam boiler that they fired up for us. Do you want to, this isn't a very emotional thing, but do you want to give us any thoughts about how you felt doing that, knowing that your grandfather had done this so many years before?
It's a good question, Jenny. I actually found that really interesting, because I always wanted to experience what it would have been like shoveling coal inside the furnace in the engine room. And that actually gave me the first-hand opportunity to do that. And I actually done it, and it was actually really hot, and it was quite humid as well, and it was quite dirty with the coal. But it was actually a great experience, because it gave me a better idea of what life would have been like on board a ship and doing the actual job. And from what I hear, my grandfather was a big bloke, and he done a lot of physical demanding jobs, and he's a labourer in Birmingham Midland Motor Cylinder Company, and he was a labourer again in Accles and Pollock. I thought that I can imagine how he would have worked as a fireman.
Thank you. I wasn't there that day. I wouldn't have been shoveling coal. Okay. We have a question from Cliff Pereira in Hong Kong. Hello, Cliff. You're a very loyal attendee of our lectures. Do you have a date, Asif, for the pen sketches of the CDs?
I actually have, I don't have an actual date because the actual book was actually published in 1892, where I got the sketch from. And I've got the actual original book of the 1892 edition. But again, it doesn't actually have a date in the book, but it does have a handwritten date of 1896. But I know the book was published in 1892, so it's a lot earlier.
Yes, thank you.
I hope that helps.
I hope so. And Cliff was talking also about jumping ship in New York. He wonders whether thinks that there's evidence that Asian crew were not allowed ashore. Is that right?
I actually might differ with that because I read in Dr. Ahmed Khadikhan's memoir, who he was with my grandfather as a seaman, and he actually mentions that they were let off the ship in New York, and they went in and they explored New York. And then again, he mentions various accounts of when he stayed at the Royal Victoria Dock. He mentions that him and another colleague went into sea, and then he went to visit a friend who was working at a factory as well. And he gives these various accounts in his memoir.
Thank you for that. Georgie, you were nodding. Do you want to add something?
No, I just wanted to add that just because somebody came off a ship didn't mean to say that they weren't meant to go back afterwards, and that some people would have gone off ships for a set amount of time, but then if they stayed, then they could be aliens, and they could be imprisoned, and they could be deported. And it changed, in different ports in the US and across the British Empire. And actually, as well as Cliff here, we've got Naina, who you spoke about earlier, who's done some fantastic work on seafarers and mutinies on ships between the two wars. So I don't know if she wants to add anything to this, but it's great.
Sorry,
Naina's joining from India.
Sorry, can I just mention that from the accounts I read of Dr. Ahmed Khadikhan, he does mention that before they left London to go to New York, they had ID cards made by the P&O, and they had to show these ID cards when they were at New York and when they left ship, and they had to return and show these ID cards too. So there was some sort of thing about them not being allowed off ship for too long and so forth.
When I was doing some research for the exhibition, I found one story about from New York, crew actually leaving the ship with their belongings strapped around their necks and on their backs, including saucepans. So that's one story. And one of the other families we found, Abdul Salah, his grandfather and younger brother of 14 jumped ship in New York. I don't know whether it was literally, but arrived in the UK in 1917 and became political activists, Ayub Ali Salah and Ayub Ali Master, and ran the Curry Cafe, etc., for disadvantaged seamen who had been left behind in the UK. And that's where some of that family history that comes from and traces back to. Naina is responding, but she asked a question earlier. Do you have a date for the pen sketch of the CDs? Did I ask that?
Yeah, that was Cliff.
Yeah, okay.
Naina was asking about the photographs.
That's right. It was, gosh, yes, I've lost it. The photographs of
the torpedoed
ships. Where do they come from in World War II?
That's interesting because I've actually purchased those from historic images in America, and they've come from there, and they're actually ex-press photographs that I've purchased.
Yeah, okay. Right. Wonderful research, Susie Cox says, P&O Heritage. Susie, you have been an absolute dream to work with as senior curator at P&O Heritage. She's saying the P&O stencilings date from 1890 to 1891, so you weren't far out. And going back to a couple of comments, 1 second, from Jeffrey Renshaw. Up to 8 Lascaux firemen were housed in one cabin. POs were single berthed, so you can imagine how crowded that was. And Indian cooks were nearly always Christians for obvious reasons. And we have an image in the exhibition of stewards from the island of Goa, Portuguese stewards who were Catholic. So it was a very multicultural affair. Okay, I think that probably covers everything.
Have you got the, Jenny, sorry to interrupt, have you got the question from Susie Cox, who I know works
it's not
P&O archives?
She's also saying, do you know where your grandfather left P&O, and was there a specific reason?
It's a good question again. I know that my grandfather left the P&O in 1950, around about 1950, because my grandmother mentions that she mentioned his entire, what shall I say, employment history, where he worked on a tramming Smethwick, and he worked in Birmingham Midland Motor Cylinder Company. She mentions he worked at Ackles Apollo. She mentions that my husband worked in P&O, and she says from the First World War right up to the Second World War. And I know through all history that was transmitted to my mother, via my mother, sorry. And she mentions that my husband left the P&O in 1950 after my father was born. When my father was born, they always wanted a son. And my grandmother had 4 daughters, and she wanted a son. She had a son, and my grandfather also wanted a son. He's really eager to have a son, and then he was so happy that he decided to leave the P&O and go to the UK and settle in the UK for a better life, to earn a living and to bring his son up in the UK. And he settled here in 1952.
Thank you.
So he left the P&O 1950. My father was born in 1949. So he left the P&O just after my father was born, and he settled in the UK in 1952. So it's somewhere between 1949 and 1952. I guess it was 1950.
Thank you very much. Susie also offers to invite you to see the model of the Syria, which was Rahima Hassan's ship, and hope some more memorabilia from the ships your grandfather served on. So I'll make sure the two of you are in touch. Cliff Pereira corrects my geography and says Goa is not an island, so apologies for that. And I think that probably draws the questions to an end. I'm scrolling up and down to see if there's anything else that I haven't touched on. I think that will do for today, as we're running out of time. So back to you, Alistair.
Thank you. I'm just going to actually tidy up nicely. Susie Cox's, Susie, hi. Very nice to hear from you again, who is the senior curator at the P&O Heritage Collection. Says that she believes that the P&O pencilings dates from 1890 to 1891. We have some of the originals in our collection, the P&O collection, she says. So thank you very much for that, Susie. And also for Clifford and for everyone else. And thank you, Jenny, for answering, for putting these questions forward. Now, would you like to talk about next month before we?
Yes, I will. We're starting our 2nd year of Zoom lectures. It doesn't seem like it, but we've done a whole year, which is fantastic. So something new, tales of the sea, maritime experiences and anecdotes from our sailing community, master mariners and others. Alistair and I will attest to the fact that there's always a tall tale over a glass of something in the wardroom. So we'd like to capture some of them next time.
We're good at the last train, aren't we, Jenny?
Sorry?
We're good at the last train home, aren't we?
We are good at the last train home, or missing it completely, as I have done. We'll send you all details in due course, and this is a thank you too for any donations you've made or will make to us, because without your help we can't do the amazing job of preservation and maintenance of the Wellington and the running of the trust. We thank you so much.
Well, if I may now conclude, it just remains me to thank both of you, Georgie and Asif, for a fantastic session. Each and every one of these monthly lectures is so different. We come to them with expectations, and I can say with all honesty that never have they ever failed to do anything except exceed. I think this has been a real taster for the exhibition that sadly we don't have on at the moment, but by golly, am I looking forward to next year's. It was a fantastic bit of research that you've done, Asif, from small beginnings, just wanting to know about your grandfather. And for you, Georgie, to have your expertise and your, well, extraordinarily in-depth expertise. I'd love to know more about the European border thing sometime, but I will talk to you about that maybe separately. I just think it's been a most lovely evening, and I hope everyone else has been on as appreciated as well. Now, as we move on, that is the end of the formal bit of the evening. Thank you again. And if you would like to stay on, our IT guru, young Matt Edgar, will bring you in, and let's chat away. If you have a glass, even better. Very good. Thank you for coming. For those who are going, good night. For those who see you in a minute, see you in a minute.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, here we are. Golly, and we have our two speakers tonight as well. How fantastic. I'd love to see you again. I want to go straight in and ask you, Georgie, this, you talk about this emerging experience of borders in Europe. How does what you're doing touch on that area? And I suspect I know maybe part of the answer.
I just want to say hello to Cliff, because I haven't seen him for many years. And it's lovely to see you, Cliff. And you're in Hong Kong.
Yes, it's lovely to see you as well. It's early in the morning, 2:45 a.m. on Tuesday morning.
I don't know how you do it.
Well, Alistair, what I did was I had a little nap a bit earlier on in the evening, and then let the other half turn in, and I stayed up.
We're very, very honoured. Exactly. You can have a large whiskey to send you off to sleep again after.
That would be a good idea.
That's very good indeed.
Great to see you, Asif and Georgie, again. It's you know, every time I hear you speak, Asif, I hear more discoveries and more stories, and I just totally kind of get infused about doing more work on my own family history. I'm really glad that you've been working on the Cook's cards at the National Maritime Museum. Of course, they're a huge help to the Goan community because so many of our ancestors were on those ships as cooks, including my own. And for a long time, we didn't really have access to much of that information. So it's helping to fill in a lot of blanks in our family histories. So thank you very much for your contribution to that. And Georgie, I'm still reading your work on East London. I still have the book on the shelf here. And I've been referring to it as I work through my Masters of Research. I'm just coming to the end of that. the kind of questions I was asking were because I've been looking at the very forgotten story of Black and particularly African crewmen in Southeast Asia as part of my master's. And I've been looking at their role both in military bases, in navies. I initially thought that they weren't any in the Portuguese Navy, but then found a document of payment to 4 Mozambican soldiers attached to the naval detachment in Macau in the Second World War. So that kind of changed my view very suddenly. But what I did notice was that in the First World War, the number of Africans arriving in Southeast Asia at first looks negligible, but then when I actually looked at some photographs from the National Maritime Museum, I discovered a Somali crew on the HMS Venus. And so I then went to the logs of the ship and actually tracked them back to East Africa and the whole story, and found another ship with Somali crew. But
Was
then
that
there's
a naval ship, Cliff?
Sorry?
Was that a Royal Naval ship?
Yes, yes. The HMS Venus is a Royal Navy ship.
Well, of course, yeah, but I'm talking about another ship. You
Yes, the
another
other ship was also a naval ship as well.
I'm very intrigued with that.
And of course, work I've done previously with Sea Power in Australia identifies Africans on board one of their ships as well.
Yeah.
But there's a period between about 1901 and the First World War where there seems to be a kind of total lack of African seamen on board the Royal Navy ships. But we also see at the same time in the merchant navy in eastern waters, and I mean Southeast Asia, a change from African sailors, particularly as stokers, to the Punjabi stokers that Asif has been talking about.
That's fascinating.
Yes, and that's why I was asking about the sketch, because prior to that, since the opening of the Suez Canal, we see these Somali stokers very often contracted in Aden, which of course is a coaling station, or Perim Island, to be precise. So that's a connection that, of course, connects places like Newport in Wales and other parts of the world with this Somali diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
But then, this decline and their replacement with Punjabis is also quite fascinating.
I wonder if that was done through, or whether that happened through local politics back in Somalia. I don't know. Whether there was an embargo put on except the sea is a free place. People go to sea. You can't stop them going to sea. I don't know. This is interesting. It's really interesting because I wish, actually, Jenny, I wish that what's our co-trustee's name? I have a very, thank you. I had a very senior moment then. Mansour Ali. He was very keen, I think, to know whether, particularly in view of the HMS Wellington, whether there were overseas African or even Asian crews. And I don't think this has been widely researched, Cliff, at all.
Well, I have done some work myself for UNESCO on Asian and African crews, more specifically on African crews on various ships and that whole story of African crewmen. But in the case of my master's, I'm actually looking at the African presence in Southeast Asia. So these comparisons come out when you look at crew lists and when you look at passenger lists and people coming ashore and that sort of thing. But they also come out with the actual, in the case of the Royal Navy, with the logbooks, where you can actually see, references to either Lascaux or CDs being taken on, but more often CDs.
Interesting indeed.
Sorry, I was just seeing that Sonia Grant is here, and I don't know, Cliff. Have you come across Sonia's work?
I've heard Sonia's name, but I've not come across her work.
So I won't speak for Sonia. Sonia can come in if she wants to. But she's been doing some fantastic research into Arab Yemeni seafarers in a similar time period.
Very interesting indeed.
And you heard me say earlier, I think, that we have discovered so much material that we're going to try and expand next year when we launch the exhibition. So Sonia, I may be in touch with you.
Yeah, sure. Anyway, it's good evening to various. The fakes again, good evening to you. Good to see you both. I hope you're well. Good to see you back. And David, down in Cape Town, David Blake, listening to the story of African seamen in the Royal Navy. That might have been a bit of interest to you. Solmaz, how lovely to see you as well. Good evening to you. Hope you're well. And Roger Höfling, you're there. You never show your face, but it's good to see you there again. And Terry, terrific to see you as well. And Peter Matthews, Ellie Burkett, Bill Allen, which it says still at work by the looks of it. And Margaret Goodra. I've got dots after that bit. But anyway, I think that's going to be something like Goodrich, I would guess. And Shamsul Alam, very good and welcome to you. And we had Ahmed earlier on, I think, as well, who I noticed was one of the questions or questioners. I wonder if he's still there with his question. Let's have a look. Yes, Ahmed, he asked, and perhaps this is a bit naughty, I'm going after the event to ask you a question. Were Lascaux allowed to reconnect with their families at ports? Did this have any bearing on Asif's family finally settling in London? That's a very good question, actually, isn't it? What do you think? Is there any elements of truth in that, do you think, in your case, Asif?
Yeah, I actually think about my grandfather. We actually didn't have family here then when he came here. So it's just impossible to reconnect with family when you actually don't have no family here. But I think that reading the accounts of Dada Ahmed Hadar Khan, I learned that he reconnected with friends that were working, in factories here in London. So it's difficult to say whether they would have reconnected with family.
Yeah. Interesting one.
I mean, I could just add something, bringing me back to the question that you asked me originally about the work on borders, because you asked me something which is very, very, very complex, but just to focus on what we're talking about now, I mean, when people think about borders, they tend to think about, lines on maps, but the ship was itself a border, because, the seafarers were not allowed to leave the ship. And if they did, they were effectively crossing the border. And why were they crossing the border? So you only have to read the oral histories from Caroline Adams or from other people who've done similar work, not just in the UK, but I think in Durban, in Australia as well, to see how strong that border around the ship was at different points of history. But read the oral histories that Caroline Adams collected, particularly referring to the time during the Second World War when people did jump ship. They did cross that border very often because they were mistreated on the ships or because of the low pay, etc. They wanted to get re-employed on British articles. But some of them talk about the networks of family members or people from similar areas who did join up with each other and managed to set up some of the early cafes, restaurants, boarding houses, support networks, etc. So, I'm sort of sticking to the line that it wasn't really allowed to leave the ship, but that didn't stop people leaving ships.
These days in the modern merchant navy, and I wasn't in the merchant navy, I was in the Royal, but Terry, I'm sure you would have a comment on this maybe. but I had the privilege of being about 3 years ago, being on board a tug with the Federal Master out in New South Wales. He was a tug driver in his retirement, pushing around large tonnage. And I know that the turnaround time there for that vessel alongside was 22 hours. And they were working, and there was no way, containers on and off continuously. And there was no way that they had time to go ashore. But the question was, would they be allowed ashore? I don't know. It's an open question. But is there any residue maybe in modern seafaring? Obviously, with tight money and money being sent back to families. I wonder to what extent the experience of the Filipinos and the Guyanese and whatever is these days compared with 100 years ago.
There's a comment from Naina again. Asian seafarers not being allowed in North American ports. I think they weren't allowed to be discharged and paid off in non-Indian ports, but were given leave when the ship was berthed for a while.
Interesting. Yeah. There we are. Golly. Well, this has really been the most absorbing evening.
Alistair, can I just say hello for a minute?
Yes,
I don't know if you this John's just pulled this off the shelf. It was made out of a packing case by the Indian carpenter on the ship he was on.
London Spirit in 1960.
Good heavens.
And they just carved it all out of an old packing case.
Isn't that beautiful? Out of packing cases.
Yes.
Yeah, out of a packing
That was the chippy, was it, John?
That was the first trip to sea. That was, yeah. I needed, I didn't have a frame for my girlfriend.
Yeah.
And, which happened to be dark, yeah. And Sally said, "Don't worry, I'll sort you out with a photograph frame," and that's what he produced.
That's beautiful work, isn't it?
Beautiful.
It's a bit dusty.
Yeah, of course. But just thought you might like to see it. Yeah.
I think it's absolutely wonderful. If ever there was, well, it'll never be the case. It will stay in the family. Otherwise, would you bring it to the Wellington? We'll put it in there.
Yeah.
People on board. Absolutely. Yeah.
Different photograph in it.
Exactly. Yeah. David, how's life down in SA? It's probably rather uncomfortable at the moment, isn't it? Or are you okay down in the Cape? Are you away from the troubles?
I would hesitate to speak too soon. We've had a little trouble, but certainly the Cape province has been a little safer, shall we say, and hopefully, and we pray seriously that things will start to improve, and that we get a serious and dedicated government, and not one that's pussyfooting, if you like.
It's a dangerous vacuum at the moment, isn't it? Really, I'm so sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh well, we must keep off that subject. It's too much of a preoccupation for you, I think, at the moment.
That's very true. Yes. But from our end of the world, there was some interest. And it concerns the Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, that were coming up to a centenary when it got crushed in the ice. Really? And so the research ship, South African research ship, Agulhas 2, will be going down in February with some underwater vehicles, which they're hoping will be able to find the wreck. And
do they have any idea what sort of depth we're talking about there?
I didn't get that so far, but that could be something for Wellington Trust in a year's time or something like that when the results come out.
That would be absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. But sorry, I was going to say, but the sad thing to note is that just near where our rooms are was the Missions to Seafarers, and that closed down probably about 3 or 4 months ago.
Oh, really?
And it's just well, you can imagine that all the people now they do it all on a cell phone.
Yeah.
And so they get a little SIM card for the port where they're in, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so lovely rooms built in the 1940s, and they're going vacant. If you want to start a chapter of Wellington Trust down in Cape Town Harbour, there's accommodation for you already.
Well, thank you very much indeed. You will be our local rep, if I might say so, David. Right, Jenny, we noted that fee. We got that, haven't we?
Got it.
That's good. And that's very sad. Talking of missions to Semen, I'm sort of a council member. I think I'm a trustee strictly of the old Felsted School, which is a minor public school in North Essex. Felsted School Mission Council. There was an old Felstedian who in 1883 built a church down in Royal Albert, Custom Key. No, what? East of Custom Key. The Church of the Ascension. Do you know about that one, Georgie, by any chance? It was an old mission church.
No, but that kind of links quite nicely with something else that Asif and I wanted to mention, which was about Kamal Chunchi Way. Everybody knows probably by now that the Mayor of London is moving its headquarters away from opposite the Tower of London to the Crystal Building, which is at the end of the Victoria Dock, just by where the tidal basin was. It's taken over the building that was built by Semen's Brothers, and the address was Semen's Brothers Way. And there was a consultation which both Asif and I were involved in, Rosina as well, and then there was a public vote. And so now the official address for the Mayor of London will be Kamal Chunchi Way. Kamal Chunchi being somebody who set up a mission for, in the language of those days, coloured peoples in around that dock area, and he was an anti-racist campaigner who worked with seafarers and families of people who had settled in that area. So that's kind of quite exciting news, because it just means that the whole, many more people are going to begin to know about these histories, just because they're going to have to address their letters to Kamal Chunchi Way.
But that's a marvelous story. I didn't know they were moving. They're leaving the building that has the unmentionable before 9 o'clock title.
That's right.
On the south bank of the river by Tower Bridge.
That's right.
Anyway, if ever it was helpful, I will put you in touch with the rector at. In fact, he's a priest in charge, I think, at the missioner at the Church of the Ascension, because there are, I think, church records which might be helpful in research purposes. Well, I think probably it's now 7 minutes past 8. That might be time to draw stumps, if that's not a mixed metaphor. It's great of you all to stay around afterwards, so thank you so much for that. And we hope you'll see as many as we can of you next month. And Cliff, double thanks to you as well, out in Honky Fid. I'm very pleased to see you're flying the white ensign over your right shoulder. That's very important to me. So thank you all very much. Drop off as you will, and I'll stay on and turn off the lights at the end.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks, me. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.